Okay, and good to see everybody. Thank you for joining what I know for a lot of people is of the start of summer. And so, as Finn mentioned, what I'm going to be doing is profiling I guess, a number of studies we have done, which really speak to the connection of TB epidemics, sort of across the globe, in particular, from sort of high burden, typically low income settings and high income countries like the United States. So a lot of this work was done under a mathematical modeling agreement with the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. So here we go. I'd like to thank the funding and others who helped with this research. I think this is actually, I realize now, embarrassingly, a partial list of all collaborators for the set of studies I'll be showing, but certainly, collaborative work across Harvard and other academic institutions, and also various places at the CDC. With the CDC, we work with the division that works on domestic TB elimination. That's DTBE. Um, but they are very aware of the connection of the US TB epidemic to other countries, and so in this work, we've worked with other divisions, the Division of Global Migration Health, and the Division of Global HIV and TB. So this was a kind of successful collaboration across different CDC divisions. So with that, again, this is, in some sense, a US-centric presentation. So what you're seeing here is the trend in TB notifications within the United States sort of over the last, was it 75 years? So in 1953 is when they started sort of routine reporting of TB cases. They had reporting of TB mortality going back further. We've actually tried to dig into those data as well. But here you can see, certainly some things that break the trend, but overall, kind of a log linear decline in TB cases inside the United States over this whole period. Um, just to highlight the things that break this trend, we've got a period in the 1990s which coincided with both the HIV epidemic in the United States as well as a weakening of TB control efforts in the United States. So they sort of came together to cause this sort of 5 to 10 year period of increased TB rates in the United States. And then when we keep marching forward, we get to this point here where we have the impact of the pandemic, where there was a short-term decline or I guess a 1 year decline in TB incidence, and then really it's been increasing ever since to a point where this year you can see that TB case rates are higher than they've been in about the past 10 years. Unclear where that's going, but certainly a point of concern. Another thing you can see on this plot is these blue and green lines, which is breaking out overall TB cases amongst those born within the United States in blue and amongst those born outside of the United States in green. And, very clear trend from, in the 90s, a point where most TB in the United States was amongst individuals born within the United States, to a point where we now have 75 to 80% of all TB arising amongst individuals who are born abroad. And there's good reason to suspect that trend will continue, really, unless there are huge changes in sort of migration into the United States. So the questions we've been trying to answer with the CDC has been firstly to sort of dive into these broad trends to understand a little bit better the patterns of risk in the community, and then also to conduct modeling analyses to say, well, where are these lines going in the future, and what levers do we can turn that will help the US sort of progress towards TB elimination. So as you've seen from that graph, there is a central role for TB amongst migrants, that is people born outside the United States, entering the United States to live. So a central role for TB amongst migrants for driving TB trends. And what I'm going to use to illustrate that point is a sort of statistical modeling study we conducted a couple of years ago, really looking at the foreign-born population in the United States and sort of trying to understand at a high level of granularity who is developing TB, trying to, rather than thinking of this as a kind of monolithic homogeneous group, what are the differences in risk within that group? So this graph is showing you how the risk of developing TB for US migrants changes as a function of the number of years since they entered the United States on the bottom and the age at which they entered the United States on the vertical. And this is deliberately organized this way, thinking about, for these migrants, it is unlikely that they will be exposed to TB infection while in the United States. Typically, people will face a higher force of infection before entry. And so the question of, will they and when will they develop TB in the United States will relate to sort of how much TB exposure to TB infection they had before they entered, which crudely we're approximating here as a function of age, and then how the risk of progression changes over time as the delay between, since infection gets larger. So here in this plot, dark blue colors are low risk, dark red colors are high risk. You can see that, in this first year since entry, a very high risk of developing TB really across the whole age range, except for the very youngest ages, right? So 0 to 5 years old immigrants are relatively low risk. But then as people get sort of the increasing number of years in the United States, that risk goes down and down and down. And so if we think about individuals who entered the United States at a young age, between 0 and 10, if we look out later in their lives, they actually have a very low risk of developing TB. The highest risks amongst people who, enter the United States at an older age, and then they've entered the United States relatively recently. I guess for context, most people who come to the United States as a migrant are coming, around these age groups of 18 to 30, sort of where the bulk of migrants are coming into the United States. Okay, so digging into that in a little bit more detail, here we're looking at plots of relating country of birth and TB incidence rates in the country of birth as estimated by the WHO to their TB incidence rates in the United States. And so each dot here is a country. The size of the dot represents the sort of number of individuals living in the United States. So for context, this very large circle is Mexico. And then we've called out some of the outlier countries. So this is Guatemala, this is Barbados, this is Belarus, this is South Africa. But what you can see here, certainly there are, these outliers, but there is a strong, positive trend. As we should expect that people migrating from countries with a high incidence of TB, have much higher risk of having been infected with TB before entry to the US, and potentially a high risk of being infected recently before entry to the US. And in the United States are also found to have, high, high TB incidence rates. And so, yeah, and also one can start to tell stories about some of these sort of countries that are sort of further away from the diagonal. But, essentially the model fits in terms of thinking about a mechanistic relationship between, exposure before entry to the US and TB rates inside the US. Actually, I should have said before, like, if people have a burning question, please put up a hand or jump in, and happy to, pause during the presentation. And finally, just another exhibit. So further, yes, Finn.
It was just because it's a small question related to that. The first thing I thought when looking at that was is there anything about like the cause of migration? Do you have things separated by whether people are sort of asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants? So, the South
Yeah.
African one sticks out as being I can completely see why that one looks as an outlier. And I wondered if there would be other outliers
Yeah,
that
no,
we,
that's
yeah.
a great question. And the short answer is we don't have those data. So we've been able to work with the TB US national TB surveillance system in a high level of detail, and I must say we're quite thankful for that. And we've been able to learn a lot. But uh, entry status, that is someone's visa category of entry to the United States, while there is a field for it in the this national TB surveillance system, or the I guess the report of a verified case of TB, there's a TB case reporting form. There is a field for it, but a lot of states have not been filling it in. And in those states that do fill it in, there's quite a bit of missing this. Essentially, there's concern that asking someone to reveal um, their immigration status can be a barrier to healthcare for either undocumented individuals or individuals who, might have entered under a, accepted visa class, but still for some reason feel worried about their living situation in the United States. So a lot of US states, either they weren't filling it or they stopped filling it altogether. So I must say we have tried to analyze some of those data in the states where um, you know reporting of that field has been better, but we've been turned back. It's an itch I still want to scratch because I think we would expect, right, that TB rates are going to be higher amongst asylee and refugee classes and higher amongst undocumented individuals if we think about visa classes. And if this does work mechanistically, we would expect TB incidence rates to be higher if people are immigrating from parts of society in their country of origin where TB transmission was greater. So lower socioeconomic status would be an obvious one. And I think some of that might go into, for example, we can see Guatemala up here, where in the United States, the understanding is that there is a good fraction of undocumented individuals and individuals, who are migrating for work from lower socioeconomic strata in their country of origin. For those essentially who need to fly to the United States, it is much harder for there to be that kind of economic migration, and so a lot of the sort of Central American and South American countries sort of show up on this side of the line. I think partially as influenced by the fact by these mechanisms that the people who are traveling from those countries to the United States are coming from parts of the population with just higher TB burden. No, great question. Okay. And I guess also, and I should preface this, this is like my favorite plot of, if not all time, but so I think this is what we did to try and look into essentially some of the time trends. And so that last plot was of, at a particular point in time. This is now allowing each country of origin to have its own trend line for migrants coming into the United States. So you can think of this line as representing, how much risk of TB a person had upon entry to the United States. And so a steep line would be suggesting that, even if people who migrated into the United States 40 years ago had high risk, those migrating today had much lower risk. Now, there's two things I want you to see. Firstly, how this sorts out by sort of per capita GDP in the country of origin. And so in these three panels, we have sort of the poorest third of sort of countries, amongst those. Well, I think we're looking at 100 countries here. This is kind of the middle third by GDP, and this is the lower third. So, I'm sorry. Oh my God. So this should be the higher third. So a country like Canada, you can see here, indicated by its ISO 3 code. So it's in this sort of rich panel. Migrants from Canada have very low rates of TB incidence in the United States, and they have been dropping over time. And all these lines are declining, or almost all of them are declining, which I think speaks to the successes that most countries have had in addressing TB. But the critical thing is the differences in the slopes here, where we see migrants from high-income countries have a faster rate of decline in TB incidence risk in the United States, of a so 5% per year decline in risk. Well, if we look at those of middle income countries, it's down to about 4% decline per year. And we look at the poorest countries, it's down to it's still for most countries a decline, but a much shallower decline of 2% per year. Essentially speaking to a sort of a pattern of, where we do see TB control globally, it's happening faster in richer countries. So anyway, I think a lot we've tried to learn from these data, and a lot it probably tells us actually about the countries of origin and the patterns of success or delays in TB control in those countries. Okay, so really those are some of the data which motivated some of the analyses I'm going to spend more time on, really showing us, that there is a strong link between TB in the country of origin and what happens in the United States. In parallel with that empirical study, we've had a number of modeling studies that have sort of looked at what can be done to address TB in the United States. Those studies have shown that stronger domestic TB prevention, that is to say, providing TB preventive therapy to people who fall within risk groups for either recent infection or for TB progression. So domestic prevention can have a large impact, as can improved global TB control. Both of these can substantially reduce future TB cases. So looking at an example of each, this is from a study conducted in around 2016, really just looking at, options within the United States for accelerating declines in TB rates. And here you can see a plot showing, each of these lines represents a different sort of future scenario. Can see we're going from around 2020, 2015 through 2050. The black line is the base case. All of these other colored lines are some, additional intervention. Those two interventions which have the greatest impact, so the blue and the red line, both are focused on better preventive treatment. Either TPT provided to migrants as they enter the country, which is the red line, or improved TPT access within the United States, which should be interpreted in light of the fact that most of the people eligible for TPT in the United States are migrants. Certainly individuals with HIV, individuals with end-stage renal disease. There are certainly other indications, but the large majority of those eligible for TPT in the United States are migrants. So essentially, the red line is offering TPT at the border. The blue line is offering TPT when people are already here. I think both of these shown to be quite impactful compared to the other options we look at. And so this orange line is just the sum of all the interventions. So these blue and red are the sort of most impactful of the single interventions. So that's doing stuff inside the United States. This is a similar plot for a study that now looked outside of the United States, asking the question if, as compared to continuation of current trends, what would be the impact inside the United States of high burden countries following the sort of targets of the End TB strategy, which, as everyone will know, aspire to large reductions in TB incidence, mortality, and the household economic burden of TB, over the upcoming years. And, really starting, I guess this analysis started in around 2020. This sort of End TB strategy scenario is this orange line. And again, this is looking within the United States. This is saying within the United States, we'll actually do nothing differently. We'll just keep doing things the way we have. But what if countries from which migrants are immigrating to the United States, what if they are able to achieve better TB control? And I guess this green line is the pessimistic scenario of sort of flat trends. And I think for me, these results have most clearly highlight just how linked US TB epidemiology is to TB in the rest of the world. Like the United States, to a simple approximation, has done what it needs to do to interrupt TB transmission. There's very little TB transmission within the United States outside of some local areas. And so where there is new TB cases, it really just demonstrates, again, this connection to epidemics in other countries. And so for the study I'm going to spend most time on, so we're really motivated by those two modeling studies, trying to think about, well, what if we can put these two things together? What if, what can be the impact of additional interventions within the United States and in the countries of origin of future migrants? How will that help us achieve TB prevention or TB elimination in the United States? So getting into how we did the study, we already had the models which we'd used for those previous studies. So we updated those modeling frameworks. They weren't just a single model, but there were sort of connections between different models, which I'll describe in a second. So we could simulate policy scenarios involving both domestic and international activities. We developed scenarios for what those, domestic and international activities would be, and then, we essentially plotted the results and interpreted them. Now here, it's important to mention the political context of this kind of study, where, here we're being very, very deliberate in our interpretation to not make this a kind of zero-sum game in terms of saying, well, is it better to spend money domestically or is it better to spend money internationally? And there's a number of reasons for that. One is that domestic and international, health spending don't come out of the same bucket, and so they're coming out of different budgets. But also for that kind of thing, you will hopefully have noted that here I am really just describing the epidemiological changes and health benefits within the United States. Um, if we're really trying to say, well, what's the relative benefit of spending domestically or internationally, I think it would have to be done in a way that doesn't only focus on the benefits to the United States. Clearly, better TB services in other countries, the primary benefits of those activities are within those countries, and the effect within the United States and other rich countries is just a small secondary benefit. Here, we're only focusing on the United States, and therefore we're not trying to accomplish that kind of resource allocation question, but rather sort of think of this as a visioning exercise, saying if you know you can think of this, if the different parts of the US government were able to contribute to these goals, what could we achieve? So for the international scenarios, we really used the template provided by the global plan between TB. And so what you can see in this graph is a number of scenarios that were constructed around the global plan. So the black line is the sort of status quo. The blue line, and I should say this is global, incidence trends in India, just as an example country. The blue line is the sort of modeling results for the global plan, with the blue line being the actual modeling and the dashed line being our model fit to those trends. And then between the blue line and the black line were some intermediate scenarios, which you can see described here. And so in the green, this is just saying, okay, well, what if we don't get any new technology? What if we just see sort of scale up of current technology? In the red, this is saying, well, what if we scale up current technology and anticipated new technology with the exclusion of a TB vaccine? The blue line sort of includes everything plus a TB vaccine, and the purple line here is just saying, well, what if a vaccine actually arrives somewhat later? Like, at the time the global plan was developed, it was anticipated a vaccine might be available in 2025. Clearly, we don't have one yet. And so this is saying, well, what if a vaccine were available in 2030, which creates these different policy scenarios? Was there a question? Okay. For some domestically within the United States, so this is now some more conventional approaches to addressing TB within the United States. You'll see that these are focused on TB prevention, just because really this is the essentially treatment of existing infections is the major lever that the United States has to turn. So either providing TPT to all new immigrants, which is the first one. The second one is increasing access amongst existing US residents. And again, the large fraction of those are people born abroad. We also looked at, what might be the impact of, interventions that would reduce the duration of undiagnosed TB disease. So that's increased case finding. Honestly, this one, it's unclear how this would be done, but just to see, what happens when we turn this lever of case finding. And then the fourth one is of reducing TB treatment discontinuation and failure. I think this potentially could be addressed through improved adherence support and shorter course regimens. But honestly, scenario 1 and 2 probably amongst the most realistic, while 3 and 4 a little bit more abstract in terms of what would get us there. And then number 5 is putting all of these together. Okay, so I mentioned we discussed the models. So we had a model built for the United States. And so this is a reasonably conventional TB model. You can see there's a TB component to the model at the top. I will not be talking through all of these different arrows, but again, they're sort of reflecting the major mechanisms of TB transmission, TB infection, and progression to TB disease. Also dealing with TB drug resistance, TB treatment history, both for TB disease and TB infection, HIV, which at least historically was important in the United States, less so now. A number of other risk group subdivisions, in particular US born and non-US born, and then age. And then we had a lot of other models. And so these are sort of simplified models of TB in each of, I think, the top 50 countries from which people emigrate to the United States. I think 50 in terms of, actually, it might be like, sorry, top 30 countries in terms of TB amongst migrants inside the United States, which were used to parameterize TB burden, that is TB infection and time since initial infection, amongst the migrants entering the United States. That is to say, we wanted to have a mechanistic relationship between sort of the success of TB control in each of these sender countries and how that would affect TB burden amongst migrants entering the United States, knowing that we should expect there to be some delays and some non-linear relationships in that process. So these are, well, 30. So these are the countries. Yeah. So these are the 30 countries which we modeled explicitly. And then for the remainder, we divided them into high-income countries, which we assumed that there wouldn't be any sort of additional TB control activities, and then a sort of, the all other low and middle-income countries. You can see in this N column, this is the number of TB cases amongst migrants coming to the United States. In the period where we looked at these data from 2010 to 2020, India was actually the top country in terms of TB cases amongst the United States, but Mexico second. And so India, Mexico, Philippines, Vietnam, and China really being, 5 focus countries for the United States in terms of TB amongst migrants, related largely to the number of migrants within the United States, but also related to, their TB exposure before coming to the United States. So I mentioned we had these sort of relatively simple models for each of these countries of origin. Here you can see an example. I think this is, what is this, of 16 of them. And we calibrated that model to WHO reported TB incidence data in each country. And so that's allowed us to create scenarios for TB burden in each of those countries. We also analyzed the US American Community Survey data, which is a very large national survey, essentially replaces the decennial census for some questions. And so allowed us to characterize migration flows into the United States. Here you can see results for 3 countries, breaking migrants up into age at entry and year of entry. Um, and here is just an exhibit from the fitted model. This is now looking within the United States, really bringing us up towards the present in terms of TB case rates. And then again, at the end, you can see with the black line, which is of overall TB incidence, you can see this drop at the start of the pandemic, with this being 2020, and then this recovery. As I've mentioned, this recovery now is up, really substantially higher than it was pre-pandemic. We saw this drop in non-US born individuals and in US born individuals, affecting things in the same way. So essentially, we calibrated all these models to the data we had, and then we used them to examine these different scenarios which I described. Okay, I think we're going okay for time. And so, firstly, what you're seeing here is a kind of business as usual scenario. So this is business as usual in terms of rates of migration into the United States. And I must say, we didn't assume anything controversial in terms of what we expected in terms of future migration rates into the United States, essentially allowing for a large dip and then recovery, so during and then after the pandemic, which I think is what we've seen, and then allowing for ongoing growth in migration following US census forecasts, which sort of allow for ongoing growth in migration into the United States over time and sort of change in distribution across global areas over that period. Um, and as well for TB burden amongst migrants, we assumed it would, essentially follow the historical patterns, assuming that the success of TB elimination in each country didn't follow the global plan, but more followed the trajectory we've seen over the last 10 years. Essentially, we fit models to, the TB, annual change in TB incidence rates over the past 10 years, and then projected that out into the future. And so this is what we see inside the United States. This is now incidence rates. So non-US born at the top, US born at the bottom, and total population average in the middle. This dip here is the COVID-19 pandemic dip. And then, the sort of dots are the empirical data. And when they end, this is us projecting out in the future. You can see we're projecting, a slow decline in TB incidence rates in the future. Faster rate of decline amongst US born individuals, but certainly if we look at the overall population, what are we going here from like 2.5 to 3 in 2023, I think, down to just below 2, a long way into the future. And so this is still above the pre-elimination threshold of 10 cases per million, and a long, long way above the eliminations of threshold of 1 case per million. That is to say, if things continue the way they have been, the US is not going to achieve TB elimination anytime soon, and won't even achieve pre-elimination anytime soon if things continue as they have been. Looking in at the sort of source of future TB, and so this is estimating the number of TB cases, the fraction of TB cases in the United States between 2025 and 2050 amongst people who are not in the United States right now. And this is doing it by country of origin. And I think when you add all of these together, I mean, this list is kind of makes sense to those who know US TB epidemiology, and then, those 5 countries I mentioned, Mexico, Philippines, China, India, and Vietnam, there it's at the top of the list. I think when you add these all together, you get above 30%. That is to say, a good fraction of all the TB that occurs, between 2025 and 2050 is projected to happen amongst people who don't even live in the United States right now. And so, if we could wave a magic wand and, cure all TB infection, address all TB disease amongst current US residents, that would be fantastic. And, but, would only address about, 2/3 to half of all TB that's going to happen in the future. A lot of TB is actually amongst people who aren't even here right now, which again just reflects the role of migration in TB in the United States. Um, so there, it's 55% of TB associated with migration. Oh, again, it's people who aren't in the US right now. Now looking at the projections of these different policy scenarios. So here we are looking at scenarios for domestic TB intervention. As with the earlier plots, every line is a single policy scenario. So the black line at the top is the status quo. Don't change anything. Then each of the other lines represents some form of intervention. And so, adoption of better TB treatment regimens might be great for those who are receiving the regimen. But in a country like the US, where, transmission within the United States isn't really too much of an issue, making sure we, better treat those people inside the United States or better identify them in the purple line, they're having a very small effect on the overall trend line. So for us in the United States, TB prevention is really the key. And in the blue and the red line, just as we saw before, actually, I don't know, I wonder if I've used the same colors here. Those interventions which anticipate greater provision of TPT for migrants entering the United States, so at the point of entry, or interventions that greatly scale up the provision of TPT amongst current US residents, both migrants and others who are eligible. Those are the interventions that have a larger impact, and they could allow us to achieve this pre-elimination threshold slowly over time. The gray line is kind of putting all of those domestic interventions together. And here we're looking at, this is both the some policy scenarios for better TB control outside of the United States, and then a couple of scenarios putting all of that together. So the red, the blue, and the kind of dirty yellow we have here, so these increasing steps of the global plan. And so this is the red one is thinking, okay, well, what if we just use current interventions better? The blue one is saying, well, what if we have the current interventions as well as new interventions and technologies we anticipate coming up shortly, except a vaccine? And then this yellow one is I think the closest thing we have to the global plan scenario. This is essentially the global plan scenario, but expecting that we would get a vaccine in 2030 rather than 2035. Then in these lines down the bottom, this line, which now looks pink to me, but I'm not sure, that's essentially putting all of the domestic and international interventions together, except without a TB vaccine. And then this green line is the throw everything at it. So this is all of the domestic interventions and the international interventions plus a vaccine used internationally, but not, assumed not to be used within the United States. And you can see that while none of these lines allows us to get to this lower TB elimination threshold, they're certainly going a long way towards it. And if you sort of extrapolate out these lines, I think this model says that, it's possible that by the end of the century, we would achieve, TB incidence of less than 1 per million in the United States. But even with everything, it is not certain that we would do so. So these are some numerical results, just sort of quantifying the number of TB cases and deaths averted, the quality saved, putting an economic value on some of these outcomes. We thought this was important in addition to some of those results you just see, because it would be easy to see some of those plots and say, well, we can't achieve TB elimination under any of those scenarios. So what are we doing here? And here just making the point that while it is useful to have TB elimination as a goal, it shouldn't be the only goal. There's a lot of health benefits and resulting economic benefits that accrue from stronger TB prevention and efforts to combat TB, even if it is still chancy whether we would achieve TB elimination. Finally, this is just a plot of the timelines of summarizing some of those time changes in terms of when we would achieve TB pre-elimination, just thinking that this is another way that decision makers might want to think of this information. So here, over here, is saying, well, if we keep doing what we're doing right now, it's a long time till we'll achieve pre-elimination. Indeed, it might extend beyond the end of our analyses. And we ran these out to 2100, right? And I'm not sure if we'll have flying cars there, but there's going to be huge changes in sort of socially, geopolitically, and technology, etc., between now and then. So a lot is being held constant that will change. But if everything is held constant, we're not going to get to pre-elimination anytime soon. As we introduce the different intervention scenarios, we walk back towards the present, such that in the scenario where we introduce everything except a vaccine, it looks like we could hit pre-elimination in the United States pretty quickly. With the vaccine, you can see on that bottom of the line, this can increase the rate of travel towards these different targets. And again, this is not assuming a TB vaccine would be used in the United States, only used in countries of origin. So I think that is the major exhibits from the study. And hopefully all these summary points are now clear. So migrants, people born outside of the United States, form a large and increasing share of individuals developing developing TB in the United States. And while the United States has successfully, interrupted transmission outside, I said, of some small settings, most TB cases are rising from existing infections, primarily amongst people born abroad. If things keep going as they are, we won't get to pre-elimination anytime soon. If we sort of do better, either within or outside of the United States, we could get to pre-elimination a lot faster. Elimination itself still a while away. All of these interventions would have substantial health benefits, despite that, not getting to elimination soon. And a vaccine, even if only used outside of the United States, would still be, impactful. Now, you've probably seen that there's a lot of limitations here. So this is a modeling study that has a lot of scope and therefore needs to make a lot of assumptions to put everything together. Limitations I want to touch on here are really less about the modeling and more about, I guess, the study design, what this sort of study counts and what it doesn't count. And so one thing it doesn't count any of the costs. It doesn't count the cost of scaling up TB services in the United States, and it doesn't count the cost of achieving, I guess, improving TB services abroad. We know doing so will require technical and programmatic innovation, lots of new funding. These are outcomes that have been estimated by sort of the Global Fund investment case and the economic modeling or the financial modeling that went alongside the development of the global plan. In addition, the study doesn't count the benefits, the health benefits of achieving better TB control in high burden countries. This was really focused myopically on changes within the United States. And so, we can't come out and say, okay, this, as I said before, that this is allowing us to, say, well, what is the health gain from all these interventions? This is purely looking at the health gain within the United States, thinking that that is something that policymakers will be potentially sensitive to, in addition to hopefully to global changes. And obviously, this is just looking at the US. Now, the US is, a relatively large country, and it also receives a lot of migrants, but we would expect these results would also hold up in other high-income countries with a large number of migrants, and we can see that as we look around the world. A lot of countries in Europe, in Australasia, have a substantial fraction of current TB amongst individuals born outside of those countries. I think that's it. And so certainly happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nick. That was really, really interesting and yeah, really great. Kevin, straight in with a question.
I
Yeah,
didn't cite your
thanks.
study, but I should have.
No, that's not why I have my hand raised. Don't worry. Thank you, Nick, for a brilliant talk and really, more importantly, for the underlying work, which is fantastic. Just, I'm sure you've looked at this and obviously give a very high level summary. What does your modeling tell you about lags between sort of improvements in TB epidemiology in source countries and how they and sort of when they start to play out in the US in terms of reduced TB morbidity?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is they're shorter than I would have think. So certainly, like qualitatively, when we looked at interventions within, again, to be clear, we didn't want to trade US versus international off against each other, but the impact of greater so TB prevention and that kind of thing within the United States, those benefits started accruing relatively fast. While we looked at the other scenarios, they accrued more slowly. So, there was some delays, but I must say, both in this study and in the earlier study I mentioned at the start, I was surprised that the delays weren't longer. Now, I think that speaks to several things. One is we were taking the global plan at face value, and the global plan anticipates relatively rapid scale up of services. I mean, it's those scenarios are being designed to hit a goal, and that goal is coming up pretty soon. So this is saying that TB incidence and therefore TB transmission, right, if you assume there's a mechanistic relation there, in countries of origin is dropping pretty fast under the global plan scenario compared to a status quo. So that's one thing. Changes are happening fast in countries of origin if you take the global plan as your starting point. Then within the United States, the second point is that even though someone can enter the United States and develop TB 25 years later due to an infection that was present at the point of arrival, while that, can happen, the large majority of TB cases amongst migrants are happening, reasonably soon after entry. As I said, I think it is something like that maybe 15% of TB cases are in the first year, if I'm not wrong about that. I think it's like that. And certainly the majority within the first 5 and 10 years. So while, we can see this as a durable endowment, the large majority of the risk is certainly quite soon after entry. And so that's the other reason it happens quickly is that in the end, people immigrate to the US, they have a high TB risk, and then afterwards they have a much lower risk and certainly much higher than US residents, but it's declining over time.
Great,
So
thank you.
lags, but not as big as I thought they would be.
Thanks, super, thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Peter, do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Great talk. Really nice. So I'm sitting in a country where 70% of TB notifications are amongst people born outside of Scotland. So something we're thinking about very carefully here right now. And I know the UK government, the Scottish government, and others are currently consulting around new strategies for detecting and preventing TB in migrant populations. One of the options on the table is pre-entry IGRA screening for TB exposure. I'm wondering about your thoughts about that. What is the thinking in the US? It'd be interesting to compare with how the thinking here is going.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so in the United States, they have been changing their technical instructions progressively over time. And so I think most recent change was, before I think last year, the biggest change was, requirement of culture amongst people coming into the country to identify TB disease. Now they've recently changed it, and it only affects certain visa classes. I should know this one, but to require IGRA. I think that these interventions can be impactful because they are potentially addressing TB risk at a point where TB risk is potentially greatest. I think that migrants are a relatively vulnerable population. And so I think if this is done, it needs to be done carefully. And I know in the United States, they're thinking about this very carefully. Someone who has TB infection, while they have risks of TB in the future, the large majority of them won't develop TB. Like one would be fantastically, happy with your prevention program if, future TB risk amongst the pool of people you're treating is like 3%, right? And so the large majority would live out a fantastic life without treatment. So I think we've got to be very careful in terms of how we offer, and certainly wouldn't require TB preventive treatment, knowing that it has a number of downsides. So that's to say, so it's a balance. I think this can be a very good group to offer services to, just as long as it's done in the right way.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Daegu.
Yeah, and then Finn, I think there's a comment. There was a comment in the chat after that.
Ah, thank you.
No, okay. Oh, thank you very much for this very useful presentation. So mine is a very quick question about the classification of individuals, as foreign-born and U.S.-born. So someone can be born immediately, after entering the country. People born to the families of migrants. How are they classified in your study? Because the level of exposure can be different also.
Yeah, great question. And certainly in this study, we learned a lot about US Census, I guess, decision making around classification. So here we follow the US Census definition of non-US born, where certainly anybody born inside the United States, and actually I should say, and to do so, we follow the definition of citizenship, which is so anyone born in the United States is US born. Interestingly and counterintuitively, anyone born outside of the United States to US parents is also US born, which, right, so that doesn't work, but that is the way it's classified. And to be able to use the full richness of the data in the American Community Survey to sort of characterize who is so exactly who falls into which demographic category. And given that this was a study funded by the US government, we use the census definition. So certainly someone who is born within the United States, the example you gave, shortly after entry shortly after entry of their parents, would represent a US-born individual. They are not eligible for these TB preventive programs through other studies, not studies we've done, but we know that those individuals have a higher risk of TB, but we didn't look at them. Certainly, we would expect to see, benefits in that group if their parents received, TB preventive treatment and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Daegu. And then Nick, yes, you mentioned a question in the chat, which I'm sure is one on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, so did we look at the impact of reductions in the funding landscape or access to new diagnostic tools? So yeah, you can see this is a last year analysis in terms of what we think the future looks like. And I think last year maybe the more prescient amongst us might have seen what's coming, but we didn't. So we are doing new work to sort of say what the implications would be, not just for the US, but for all or a wider set of high-income countries. We've got a student sort of finishing it up right now, where that was completed as part of a PhD program last year, which also didn't anticipate funding reductions, but now we've modified it to look at, I think, the scenarios we are facing today. In your mind, hopefully you can invert the lines that you saw. So in that, if we saw, great improvements in TB amongst countries from, where people immigrate to the United States, it is better in the United States. Similarly, if we see TB epidemics take off in other countries because of withdrawal of US and potentially other support to TB programs and to HIV programs, I should note, then we should expect that TB in other high-income countries will follow those trends. And as we see a bigger split between sort of locally born individuals and foreign-born individuals in terms of TB rates, then just the foreign-born individual, essentially the rich country, the high-income country, TB rates just become increasingly tied to TB rates amongst migrants. I mean, the thing to note there is this is all assuming that immigration follows its historical patterns. In the United States, we see a government which is doing a lot of stuff. And so it is withdrawing funding from foreign health aid, but at the same time, putting great constraints on migration. I think forecasting migration patterns is um, it's for someone who has a lot of confidence in their own abilities. I think it's tough to do. But even if there is a short-term dip in migration into the United States, personally, I'd be surprised if that is a long-term pattern. And also noting in the United States, a good fraction of migration is undocumented. People coming into the United States without a formal visa class, or people who enter the United States under a formal visa class but then stayed. And so, just simply turning off the tap on migration might certainly isn't in the economic best sense for the United States, is my understanding, but also might be hard to implement. But just to know that'll also matter. But certainly, yeah, in terms of just clarifying what it means for high income countries if they stop supporting TB programs abroad, that is certainly something we're trying to investigate. Did we look at new diagnostics within the United States? I think TB diagnosis everywhere is imperfect. Even in the United States, 18% of people will be placed on treatment without being bacteriologically confirmed, and it's not through trying, a lack of trying. It's, TB diagnosis is hard. But in the United States, essentially we didn't need to look at sort of better lab tools. Outside of the United States, yes, that was built into some of those global plan scenarios.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Maybe, Nick, a last question before we close, if nobody else has any questions. I'm not sure if I missed it, but you were obviously thinking about new TB vaccines and their application in high TB burden countries and not in the United States. I couldn't remember if you explored a scenario where that was something similar to TPT on sort of entry or something, TB vaccines were offered. I wondered if that was a scenario that might be conceivable in the future.
Yeah, you'd think that in a setting like the United States, where, TB prevention, treatment of existing infections is the, big knob we can turn, that a post-exposure vaccine of the type that are currently investigated would be high value. The fact that we didn't look at it within the United States was a reflection of the priorities of our, essentially, the US government didn't want to look at it. And I think there are reasons to think that, it might not be the top priority, but at the time they didn't see that as a question they wanted to answer. And so we took our cue from that.
Brilliant. Thank you. And with that, we're at half past the hour. So thank you very much again, Nick. That was really, really interesting and really great to see.
Cool.
Just for everybody, I think we are meeting next month and we're going to hear about modeling for national strategic planning in China, I believe, which will be really interesting and sort of looking at this from the other perspective. But thank you very much again, Nick, and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and certainly happy to follow up on any of this material if anyone's interested. This is in the moment, as someone mentioned, I think just trying to clarify what are the benefits of better TB control is, I think it's a message we need to communicate clearly. So happy to talk about this further. Thanks, guys.